Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the afternoon session on international security implications of SRM. We're really happy to have you here. I see this as more of a dialogue and an exchange of different perspectives on this issue, since no global-scale SRM has been deployed as of yet. So just a discussion on various approaches to thinking about national security and international security implications of this emerging set of technologies. I'm Tyler Felgenhauer. I'm a research director at the Duke Center on Risk at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. I look at the risk trade-offs related to SRM, look at scenarios, and then some research here on security risks, as well as on a project on international monitoring for SRM. Our next speaker after me will be Scott Moore, who will be presenting remotely, recorded remotely. Scott is a practice professor of political science and director at the Penn Global Climate Security and Geopolitics Project at UPenn, and he previously served at the U.S. Departments of State and Defense and at the World Bank. Next, then, we'll have a presentation by Olaf Corey, who is here, professor of global security challenges at the University of Leeds in the UK. Olaf studies the intersection of security and environment and the geopolitics and social lives of disruptive technologies. Then we're very happy to have two discussants here as well. First, we'll have Cynthia Scharf, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Future Generations, who is advising their work on SRM and other climate intervention technologies. Cynthia was previously the senior strategy director for the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. She has written widely on these topics, including in foreign policy, Politico, and science. And from 2009 to 2016, Cynthia was the head of Strategic Climate Communications and chief speechwriter on climate change for the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, where she supported and advised the UN Secretary General during the landmark Paris Climate Change Agreement. And then finally, we're very happy to have Gwynne Dyer, and I thank him for the late notice and late invitation. Gwynne has worked as a freelance journalist, columnist, broadcaster, and lecturer on international affairs for more than 20 years, but he was originally trained as a historian. He's served in 3 navies and held academic appointments at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, and Oxford, before launching his twice-weekly column on international affairs, which is published by over 175 papers in some 45 countries. His books include Ignorant Armies, Sliding into War in Iraq, War, from 2004, With Every Mistake, 2005, Future Tense, among many other books, including one on climate wars and a new one on climate engineering. With that, I will start my brief presentation on different perspectives on security. Just a moment. I'll lay out some of the kind of an outline of how people might be thinking about security implications of SRM. Starting with some very basic definitions from a traditional security approach, traditional national security thinking. And our other discussants and participants will have more expanded and nuanced versions of these definitions and different ways of thinking about this. But this is how you might start from point one, where we're defining national security as basically, in essence, the protection against threats to a nation's well-being. And a threat to national security could be any action or sequence of events that threatens drastically to degrade the quality of life for the inhabitants of a nation state, or to narrow the range of policy choices available to the state or to private entities within that state. Simply put, simple responses to a threat from national security would usually follow an escalating scale, starting from strongly worded memos, diplomacy, to sanctions, other approaches, ramping up, ratcheting it up to match the level of seriousness of the threat, from another state to military strikes and full-scale war, which is what we're trying to prevent here. And in turn, that threatens the national security of the other state. And then finally, international security is just then the realization of national security for all states, where the minimum goal is the preservation of peace and well-being. That's the minimum goal. You could expand the definition of security to be other things, but that would be the minimum goal. So how does SRM fit into security thinking? First, I'll give a few general points here. SRM is not a weapon. It's not a weapon offensively. It cannot be targeted at all. It's very hard to target, even less so than other hostile environmental acts, such as U.S. use of napalm, U.S. use of Agent Orange in the Vietnam War, or more recently, Russian attacks on Ukrainian dams. It's SRM in almost all cases is very hard to target, both offensively and defensively. You could think about this idea of counter-geoengineering, but most work on this field has shown that it's very hard to engage in some sort of geoengineering that counters the effects of the original geoengineering. However, even though it's not a weapon, you could think about different treaties that exist now, and Oliver Morton here in the audience has explored, and others have explored how this treaty, the Environmental Modification Treaty, might apply to SRM. And that treaty was designed around security concerns, and it could apply to SRM going forward. Second, there's no arms race motivation with SRM. It's more of a yes, no, you have it or you don't. Building more SRM capacity, there's no sense to having some sort of conventional weapons arms race in SRM. It doesn't help you on some sort of tactical climate, in a tactical way on a climate battlefield. Nuclear weapons logic does not apply here either. First strike and mutually assured destruction, these are not applicable to SRM technologies. However, having the capacity, and if a nation has the capacity to engage in SRM, it gives them a strategic advantage. Gives them at base level, it could give them a strategic advantage in negotiations, and strategically between nations, there could be a short-lived first mover advantage in deployment. I say very short-lived. I'll go into that a little bit later. Third, if you have an adversary, your adversary's use of SRM could be harmful to you climatically, but in many, in fact, probably most cases, your adversary's use of global SRM would be beneficial to you climatically. And then finally, national security justifications can be used for both the deployment of SRM, thinking in terms of responding to climate change, or to respond against another's SRM deployment. So these are some of the usual storylines that are told when we think about the worries of security risks. A lot of people, when they say, what are you most worried about with SRM? Well, we're worried about war, which is, again, something we want to prevent. So the storyline is the simple one. Climate change worsens over time. We fail to mitigate. We fail to lower concentrations via CDR. The world passes 1.5 on to 2, on to 2.5. In the meantime, no international norms develop on SRM. No norms, no governance, no treaties, no cooperative arrangements, no moratoria, no bans. Eventually, so we're in an anarchic, governless world. Eventually, the climate impacts get so bad, the storyline goes, that a nation state is incentivized to be the first to unilaterally deploy it. This is the free driver incentive. This is the worry of many. Now, actors at the nation state level could include the weak states, doing this out of a desperate move or a ploy for attention, other motivations, doing a very small-scale deployment. You could have a single strong state, such as one of the two largest powers, the U.S. or China. You could have medium-sized states. You could have two strong states competing with each other, or a patchwork quilt of multiple-sized states, large, medium, and small. The security worries are fairly self-explanatory. If the SRM is done at a regional level and the neighbors don't like it, there are negative spillover effects or perceived negative spillover effects. There could be regional conflict. At a larger scale, the scale of the conflict might be even greater, the scale of the disagreement. There have been exercises to try to imagine futures where what is the worst thing that could happen with SRM, and how could we imagine a world that is the worst, and how do we avoid that? And the worst usually leads to some storylines, including sustained overcooling for some reason, a termination shock, or a downstream catastrophic event, usually leading to nuclear war as the worst case scenario. What are the motivations then on why a state might want to free drive, deploy unilaterally? The key word here is unilaterally, meaning non-cooperatively, without the prior consent or discussion with other states. So the benefits are clear. The one highlighted in red, the climate benefits, would be one of the key reasons we think. However, there could be many other reasons why a state would go forward with SRM that are not necessarily related to climate or even completely unrelated to climate. and climate is just used as the excuse. So there's the climatic benefits of SRM and this possible ability to optimize the SRM for your own state. However, there are other domestic political and geopolitical incentives to deploying on your own. There's the first mover advantage. You might get some temporary technological leadership or dominance. You might be able to set expectations, rules of the game. You might gain some international leadership or prestige internationally, which is a valid currency of international politics. You might have domestic motivations, staying in power as a political stunt. You know, my state is falling apart. I have no political power. Let's do geoengineering as a domestic distraction, or you might do it as a negotiation tactic to try to get climate change policy moving. Now, what are the barriers or costs for most nations? And this is following, and I refer to this paper in later slides. This is following on a lot of work earlier, but most recently, a paper by Josh Horton and David Keith and Wake Smith on which countries could actually do large-scale geoengineering. Most will have to have the ability to deploy the technology. It's cheap relatively, but it still costs billions in startup costs and billions in ongoing costs to do a large-scale deployment. They're the inherent biophysical risks. But then there are the political costs of going first. There might not be domestic support. More importantly, perhaps, if you don't care about your own public, what other countries are going to do. You might become a global pariah. Now, we've seen countries act in that way, and they don't care about becoming a pariah. There might be sanctions. We've seen countries, I'm thinking of Russia, they act without worry about the sanctions. But what is the primary risk? The ultimate risk is, well, what are other countries going to do? Are they going to attack us militarily if we go forward with this? So a common theme here then is that the motivations for deployment and the not only the motivations but the outcomes of the deployment in terms of security threats could be both climatically related and non-climatically related. So in the top row, so we have on the far left the international actor deploys non-cooperative SRM, leading to potential real-world bad climate impacts. We know that most modeling shows that SRM will be beneficially globally. However, there might be some areas that are harmful regionally. So it could result in a true national security risk at some regional level if the SRM goes poorly or if it results in unexpected precipitation changes, such as leading to drought, famine, mass migration, state collapse, which are real national security threats. Now, the second two categories then really are less related to climate. The expectation or perception of harmful climate impacts, I should have added here, or the misinformation about those climate impacts now, or expecting those in the future, or expecting them in the future because of some sort of misinformation story. That's one storyline. If another country starts to do that, it may not matter as much what the actual impact would be in your state, but the fact that they're doing it. And at a more fundamental level, at the bottom of the first column there, we don't want, say the great powers or other powers, we don't want that country to have this power over us without our consent. The United States is not going to let China control its climate, and China is not going to let the United States control its climate without some sort of negotiation. So then the second mover response might be more applicable in terms of national security thinking. Now, if you're, depending on the size of your state or your alliance with the power that's potentially doing this, you might ignore. So if a strong state is here and a small state is trying it, you might ignore them. Or if you're a weak state and a strong state is doing it, you might try to cooperate, join the coalition, join the geoengineering club to try to have influence over the temperature goal, or just to be on their side, thinking in terms of what might have happened during the Cold War, what happened during the Cold War of just large political blocs joining each other in opposition to each other. If you're opposed and you have some sort of influence, you could start to resist diplomatically, alone or in coalition, impose sanctions. You could try to mitigate more aggressively, although that might not have much impact on this. You could oppose militarily. You could try strikes against the geoengineering infrastructure, or you could just try strikes against the country. It doesn't really matter. Both would incentivize the other country to stop. You could also develop your own geoengineering. The point of this is that the tensions could arise not only from the reality of SRM's impacts, but also the expectations or perceptions of those impacts. And the second mover responses might be more serious. As I want to focus one slide before I conclude with the final slide on this idea of U.S.-China bipolarity going forward. And this is, again, is following on work of several others inspired by that work. The four quadrants here describe future worlds, four future worlds, where the assumption is that the U.S. and China would be the large bipolar, the two large powers in the world for the next several decades. We have bipolarity. In section A is a situation where both the U.S. and China are in agreement that geoengineering is bad. In section B, both come to the conclusion independently that geoengineering would be good for them. So that could result in two outcomes. A bad outcome if the U.S. develops the capabilities China develops, and they come to loggerheads and start to deploy simultaneously. However, both know objectively, and we all know objectively, that simultaneous deployments by two great powers would be bad for both. Therefore, there's an incentive if the two powers are acting rationally to cooperate on a jointly managed deployment. C or D is where one or two of where one is in favor of geoengineering and the other is not. So I'd make two claims here, and be curious to hear reactions later. I would make the claim that we're more likely to be in situation A or B rather than C or D, meaning that we're more likely that the U.S. and China would come to the independent conclusion based on their science, based on their climate exposure, based on the size of their economies, based on their technology, that this is a bad idea or this is a good idea, then they are diametrically opposed. Second claim here, which I would like to explore further in research, is that the unilateral free driver deployment would be very short-lived, say even on the span of like 12 hours. The U.S. and in this particular these two actors, the U.S. is going to be knowing what China's doing. China is going to know what the U.S. is doing and be ready. And if one country announces, the other country could announce the next day that we're doing the exact same thing. Finally, I want to quote from Holly Buck's great paper on environmental peace building and solar geoengineering. Basically something to explore that it could be the case that SRM said improves security. Quote, scholars should treat the link between solar geoengineering conflict as a hypothesis rather than as a given, and evenly examine both hypotheses, that solar geoengineering could lead to conflict and that it could lead to peace. So we know that SRM somehow, some way, could lead to potential threats to security. We also know that climate change potentially has potential causal links, though they haven't been clearly established, potential causal links to worsening international security. We also know that SRM diminishes climate change impacts, so therefore we could study this additional arrow to see, well, what if this would be a future area of research? In what ways would SRM contribute to peace rather than exacerbate security tensions? I'd like to thank participants in the Resources for the Future workshop that we had, as well as Ben and Milan, who are additional members of that project. Thank you, and I'll get to the next video presentation here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Moore. I'm a practice professor of political science and director of the Penn Global Project on Climate Security and Geopolitics at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm very sorry that I can't be there with you in person today, but I am really pleased to be able to participate in this discussion, which I think is one of the most important in all of climate policy. And let me just say a little bit about what brings me here. As I mentioned, I lead a project at Penn that looks at the intersection of climate change, international security, and geopolitics. And we do that because we believe that both for better and for worse, the global climate agenda is now shaped as much by geopolitics, geopolitical competition, and even geopolitical conflict as just about anything else. And within that, we've identified a couple of key work streams that we want to focus on, of which climate intervention and geoengineering is one. And that's an area that I've started to work on a little bit more intensively over the last 18 months or so, and wanted to focus my brief remarks today on what the conclusions that I've come to from doing that work, which has really been focused on geoengineering and climate intervention in relation to the law of armed conflict and as a potential cause of conflict and competition over climate change. Let me just stipulate at the outset, and I know we're sort of unusually here among a group of people that has thought very deeply and intentionally about climate intervention and geoengineering. But nonetheless, I think it's important to stipulate up front that I don't like the idea of climate intervention or geoengineering. In fact, I think if we end up going down that path, it will mean that we will have failed in a very fundamental sense to address climate change as an issue of global governance. Nonetheless, I think there is a very real prospect that climate intervention or geoengineering will be attempted in the very near future. And again, I'm probably not alone in this group in thinking that, but that's why I think it's so critical to have discussions like these that particularly try to convene a wide group of constituents and participants to try to think through these very contentious and difficult issues. And as much as I do think it's important to stipulate the dangers, the hazards, the kind of suboptimality of attempting interventions in the climate system to counteract rather than to exacerbate climate change, to be clear. It's something that comes up at least once in just about every climate related meeting or event I have. And I think that that is a good sign of what I think is the starting point, at least for me, and I think most discussions about geoengineering and climate intervention, which is that we are really not on a path to successfully avert dangerous climate change. In fact, quite the opposite. In fact, not only have our efforts at collective action so far failed to produce any sort of binding commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with a level consistent with avoiding dangerous climate change. But we seem to have the prospects of that slipping further and further away, not least because of growing competition and even conflict between the world's major economies, emitters, and actors in international climate policy. And I think it's not recognized as widely as it should that those three kind of distinguishing features go together. If you're a large economy, you are also a large emitter, and you are also a really critical player in international climate policy. And certainly, I think the big three that you would have to start with in that category would be the United States, China, and the European Union. I don't think it would be too controversial or needs too much discussion or explanation to begin from the premise that relations between those three key actors do not look set to be on a path in the medium term that would lead us to be very confident about their ability to engage in stronger collective action or cooperation to address climate change. We're headed in the wrong direction. And I think that's a really that's at least half the equation for why we need to think much more deliberately. And again, this convening is such an important part of that about what it would mean to create rules of the road, to create a stronger, more effective governance framework for climate intervention or geoengineering, should it be attempted or pursued. But that's really only half the equation. And it's the second half of the equation that I've focused on in some recent articles, including a co-authored piece with Craig Martin, professor of law at Washburn University, that came out in the Harvard International Law Journal back in March, as well as a piece that we had in Foreign Affairs, evocatively titled "The Battle Over Blocking the Sun." And the argument that we make in that piece is that even as the effects of climate change are accelerating and we have fewer and fewer reasons to think that we're going to be able to really avert dangerous climate change through cooperation. The barriers to entry for mounting a climate intervention that, while it assuredly would not solve the root causes of climate change, does promise to help blunt some of its worst effects. And here, obviously, solar radiation management techniques are I think the most important and biggest examples here. That even as we see the dangers of climate change accelerating, on the other side of the equation, we see those types of interventions looking more and more feasible, both technically, economically, and otherwise, to the point where we're starting to see a proliferation of private sector companies, enterprises being involved and interested in climate intervention. So we're not no longer sort of thinking or talking about this being something that would have to be organized at the scale of a nation state, but really could be quite plausibly undertaken at the enterprise level. And I'm sure you're familiar with some of these enterprises, but some of the business models actually envision generating kind of credits from seeding aerosols into the upper atmosphere and helping to cool the climate or reduce global average surface temperatures and sort of creating a marketable permit of some kind that could create revenue for the firm. At the same time, and by the same token, it's increasingly not implausible to think that a non-state entity of some kind, perhaps even a radical environmental group, or even conceivably a very wealthy individual, could decide and plausibly undertake an SRM focused climate intervention, particularly some type of stratospheric aerosol injection, which is, of course, the most commonly referred to technique. The very plausibility and feasibility of these interventions, I think, is something that is only really starting to be grappled with from a policy perspective. And one of the reasons that my co-author and I, Craig Martin, think this is so concerning is that we actually think that depending on how such an intervention was undertaken, it could plausibly be understood as a casus belli under the international law of armed conflict, and therefore potentially even be considered as a legitimate cause or pretext for armed conflict or intervention between states. It goes without saying, probably for this audience, that the international governance and regulatory framework for climate intervention and geoengineering is so haphazard and patchy that not only do we see significant risks of environmental harms, economic harms, but also potentially a significant risk of conflict as well, which is why I think it's so important to think about climate intervention and geoengineering from a geopolitical and international security perspective, as well as, of course, other perspectives as well. And one of the conclusions that we come to, Craig and I, in our writings, is that it's really, really important that whatever sort of direction we take for trying to write the rules of the road for geoengineering and climate intervention, it has to be under a platform or within some type of framework that is broad and inclusive. A key feature of climate intervention, particularly SRM and SAI techniques, is that they are essentially planetary in scope, scale, and impact, and therefore really are deserving of very widespread and inclusive consultation and participatory governance. This gathering is, as far as I'm aware, the single most ambitious attempt to do that, and I really applaud it. But I think going forward, what we need to think about is how to translate that type of dialogue and convening to a space that could plausibly develop, implement, and ideally even enforce rules of the road or elements of a regulatory framework. And we think that the UNFCCC framework would probably be the most ideal at least in principle, though in practice there are lots of barriers to that. But you could envision using other multilateral environmental agreements conceivably as a similar type of platform. Regardless, and here I'll just start to conclude, but I think what at least my research has led me to believe is that geoengineering or climate intervention, especially SAI, is increasingly feasible, practical, and therefore likely to occur. However, suboptimal that may be. I think we just have to face up to the reality that there's a very high likelihood that this is going to happen sometime soon. Someone is going to try it. The time, therefore, to start thinking about how to regulate this space is now. And the group of people or the approach to doing that should be all of us, certainly all of us at this convening, but in a wider, across a wider swath of the global South and the world at large as well. I'll stop there, but thank you for the opportunity to offer some thoughts, and I look forward, I hope, to engaging in some discussion. I'll share my contact information, but it's pretty simple, scott.moore@upenn.edu or scottmoorephd.com, where you can also find information on the Penn Global Climate Security and Geopolitics Project. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
Okay, I'll try to stick to time. So just to supplement what Tyler and Scott have been talking about in terms of whether or not and in what ways SRM could cause security problems, I'm going to try and flip that around and talk a little bit about what might security do to SRM. So if we think about security as a logic, not just about military issues, but in general a securitization logic, how does that place SRM as a policy tool, an option? So my first contention is that a lot of security dimensions are obscured by SRM tools and framings, not because they're faulty in that sense, but because a climate model obviously is a model of the climate and not of the international political system. So much of the attention has been on what would the climatic effects of a climate intervention be, rather than the political effects, which are not necessarily included. The idea that there's a benign global planner behind such modeling is also actually this is the wrong presentation. No, is it? Sorry, not the wrong presentation, but the wrong version. Yeah, this is actually the wrong version, Tyler. Is there any way of going back? This was uploaded onto the system this morning, and I checked it with the. Tech person might be useful, actually. So I went up and put it on the system, but for some reason it's not here. That's unfortunate. So I uploaded the presentation onto the system. It's not that one.
No, which one is it?
It's not there.
I'm just checking that out.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay, so maybe I should extemporate on the presentation. There are various pathways through which we've been discussing about whether an SRM intervention could lead to security problems in terms of mainly the main focus has been war and conflict in the final instance. But what I wanted to do in this presentation was to ask what happens when climate change increasingly becomes understood and framed as a security problem. In other words, what happens when it becomes securitized? Where does that leave a tool like SRM and the debate that we're having? So the first thing I would take you through is then a sort of quick theory lesson in what securitization means. I mean, what the securitization theory that came out of Copenhagen argued was that although security problems classically are framed in terms of military threats to sovereignty or to state security and what Tyler pointed to as national security, there is a way in which the same logic travels to other domains. So, for example, the war on drugs was declared by President Nixon, that this was the public enemy number one, and that a full-scale, all-out war on drugs would be launched. And that was several decades long. Obviously didn't have a huge amount of success behind it. Another example is after 9/11, there was a huge securitization of, following on from the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, which obviously it's very easy to frame terrorism as a security problem, and everybody would probably agree it is a security problem. But one of the elements of a securitization is that a specific entity or referent object has to be identified as that which is threatened. So there has to be a threat which is existential in its size and nature, and there has to then also be a valued referent object that has to survive. And if you manage to convince the relevant audience that these two things exist, it legitimates a security logic which legitimates specific kinds of policy tools which otherwise would not be permitted. So you get a state of exception which can then be translated into certain kinds of policy options which otherwise would not be permitted. So you typically get in the security sector secrecy that where you otherwise would have transparency, uses of violence that would otherwise not be permitted, imprisonment without trial, which would otherwise might not be permitted, at least in certain political systems. So securitization as a logic is now being applied to climate change. In many ways, it's being declared a national security issue. And in many ways, it's being securitized as a security problem. Now, the significance of that is that it shifts the problem into this special privileged and problematic political category. And the problem for climate change has always been, there's been plenty of emergency rhetoric, but what are the exceptional measures that go with that? So climate securitization has been all dressed up with nowhere to go. And so I argued actually back in 2012 that climate change hadn't been securitized because there simply weren't any suggestions on the table for any exceptional measures. Today I would probably say something else, which is climate change has been written into a security framework which is actually not a million miles away from the war on terror. And it's maybe not coincidental that climate security as a concept was invented roughly around the same time and promoted not least by the American military and military think tanks, which played a pioneering role in the discourse around that. So then you ask the question, what are the existential threats and what is existentially threatened? So what is the threat and what is the referent object here? And of course, that is a political conflict and a political debate about filling in those gaps. But one of the prominent ones that is, I think, increasingly prominent at least, is that climate change is causing migration, which is in turn causing conflict, so, or potentially could cause conflict. So the sort of climate wars scenarios where mass migration, typically envisioned from the global south into the global north, is depicted as the security threat coming out of climate change. And in that context, what does SRM become if climate securitization is accepted as the frame of reference and the lack of any emergency measures asks or begs for that to be filled by something, whether what is currently mainly filling that space is an emphasis on border control, migration control, to try to limit a perceived climate via migration threat to peace and security and homeland security. But whether SRM might potentially then, in this context, be reinterpreted instead of being a climate risk minimization tool, that it could pose as a sort of national security tool, and in that sense gain legitimacy as a tool that could ostensibly quickly reduce the pressures that are driving those kinds of threats. Now, the empirical evidence behind climate change causing conflict is still extremely weak. The signal is very weak, historically at least. Could change in the future. And the link between migration and conflict is also empirically extremely weak. And the theory behind why climatic shifts would cause conflict is actually also very weak, because it assumes that conflict breaks out at the same locality that climatic shifts have taken place, which, if you look at any international conflict around the world, it's very rare that you would find the cause of the conflict in the same place where the fighting is actually happening. And most migration is actually not driven by climate change yet, but is actually driven by war. So it actually goes the opposite way, that war causes migration is a much safer statement to make than the opposite, that migration causes war. But the risk in this framing is that migrants become the vector of security threats driven by climate change. And what we don't want, I think, is for SRM to take the role of the extraordinary measure, which has to be used because security implies necessity and exception. If SRM lands in that category, I think we'll all be worse off for it. And my presentation basically, I can send people the pictures later if they want, makes the case that I think we need to pay more attention as well to the ways that security could affect SRM, and not just speculating and exploring whether SRM causes security problems. I'll leave it there, time-wise. Yeah.
Thank you, Olaf, and very sorry about the slides. Thank you for pushing through. Now we have one of two discussants who would like to start. You're welcome to sit or stand here.
I think I'll stand, thank you.
Okay.
What Olaf is saying brings a very strong bell with me. I have some military antecedents. I haven't worn a uniform for a very long time, but I have hung around the military in a number of ways. And one of the things that I've done from time to time is to be called in to advise the British government. I don't sound British, and I'm not born British, but I have a citizenship. So I'm allowed to advise governments on matters arising, including climate change. And what got my attention, the first such meeting I attended, easily 10 years ago, sorry, do you want to just move that over here, yeah? Was the phrase that I was hearing on the lips of military officers, Lifeboat Britain. It's stolen actually from Jim Lovelock, who wrote about it in his first book on Gaia, that sort of thing. The idea that eventually, for various reasons, he wasn't on climate change in 1979, but the idea that the growth in energy use, the growth in population, and so on, would eventually cause breakdown, and if Britain wanted to survive, it had to bring down the shutters on all the foreign refugees and so on that would be arriving because of breakdown. And happily, it is an island and can isolate itself from the general wreck of the world beyond it. He's a nice man, actually. He just died. But he did sometimes step beyond the normal bounds of discourse. Anyway, I was hearing this very same phrase, Lifeboat Britain, picked up obviously by these officers who had read his book and probably some other things, but it was already 10 years ago part of the discussion that was taking place in Whitehall about British military and political policy. I haven't been back recently, but I'd be very surprised if it has subsequently gone away. So, the message here is, first of all, the military will do exactly what you suspect they will do every damn time, which is take advantage of any passing issue and put it to work for their cause, which is the persistence and growth of the military. So you're right. You don't have to wait, it's underway. But in terms of a reliable vehicle to bring the military, in this case to whatever, Valhalla, when they are greatly in demand and encouraged to expand, the likelihood that this is the vehicle that will do so, I think, is pretty low. I mean, they grab anything that comes past, and you're quite right to identify that, but I find it difficult to sort of actualize this as a set of policies that would even benefit the military, let alone the state. There is really very little you can do. Well, let's talk latitudes for a minute. If your opponents are in the same latitude that you are, which is generally the case, whatever you do to the climate is going to be done to them and you. And that is a substantial disincentive to tamper with the climate in aggressive ways, even if you have the ability to do so. And of course, you can't really target it very well anyway. Anything you put into the stratosphere gets around the planet very quickly. It won't cross the equator necessarily, but if you're in the same hemisphere or the same 10-degree band of latitude, whatever you do to it is going to happen to you too. So in that sense, yes, it's around. They're talking about it as fast as I'm sure the Pentagon's the same. And various other places, I suspect, including China and Russia, are the same. But it doesn't really have legs, I think. I hope. The other question was running through my mind through the various presentations was, nobody brought up the question, the comment, the criticism which is often made of deploying geoengineering, which is that it would cause wars and therefore we mustn't deploy. I mean, it's as hackneyed as it could possibly be. Everybody's sort of got past that, but it still is around in the public domain. When you get a list of why we must never do any geoengineering, it's right there below moral hazard. It's just another one that you get thrown at all the time. And while I don't have to dismiss the nonsense here because nobody brought it up, I thought I'd just just throw it in anyway, because it really makes the case very clearly. It is very hard to construct a war based on actual climate change, geoengineering deployments, because nobody would do them without a fair, in realistic geopolitical terms. Rwanda's not going to do this. Even Belgium is not going to do it, and rich individuals are certainly not going to do it. But a coalition of small and middle-sized states, particularly in the tropics, could one day be imagined to do it. One great power and not the other great power seems unlikely. I find that rather hard. But really, the whole idea of constructing the scenario plausibly in which climate change or geoengineering deployment leads to war, as somebody who did indeed serve in 3 navies, I used to collect them, I can't make the scenarios plausible, but I'll leave it there.
Well, I I should start by saying I haven't served in 3 Royal Navies. So I want to thank the presenters. There were interesting insights in every one of these presentations. I'm going to kind of provide some random comments on this topic, and those comments are derived from conversations I've had over the last 8 years with a variety of governments, with a variety of NGOs, philanthropies, and in particular some security officials working in think tanks in the Washington, London kind of EU matrix. First of all, the assumption that geoengineering, SRM, let's be specific, even more specific, SAI, would be used for climatic reasons, I think is false. I think if it is used at a global scale, it would be a fig leaf for the real intent of geopolitical leverage or geopolitical prestige. It can very easily be justified or wrapped in the cloak of a climatic reason, but I strongly believe that it would be for reasons having more to do with geopolitical leverage than anything else. That is true for great powers. It is true for the US and China, I believe. And also just to reference the fact that currently there aren't that many countries who are capable of deploying SAI at a global scale. That is often a misperception. And there are several folks in the room who've written articles about this, but the current count is around 10 that could actually deploy at a large scale within the next few years. And those that could deploy SAI at a global scale without suffering potential obstacles to the completion of that are probably just 2. In that calculation, I would say add Russia and India as a wild card. Not that they have the capability necessarily, but the ability to obstruct, whether on a diplomatic level or otherwise, I would add those 2 to it. When I've had conversations about...
But there's no technology to do it, so how can you say you could do it in a couple of years?
The development of SAI depends on many factors, but I'm going on what researchers have said about the potential development at a less than global scale and then at a global scale as well.
Sorry, the mic goes.
No. That's fine.
We'll take the questions again.
Sure. A couple of other observations about this. There is quite a low level of knowledge among policymakers about SRM. There's an assumption that there's much greater knowledge than I've had the ability to encounter in various meetings. There are many exceptions to that. I would say the US is probably the most prominent exception. The intelligence community is, of course, very well aware of SRM. I think the same is true in probably the P5 countries, although, of course, we can't ascertain what's happening in Russia or China. But the level of knowledge beyond a certain elite is still at a low level. And the amount of learning that still needs to go into this topic to make informed decisions, informed commentary, the scope is quite large. As an example, it is often assumed that if there were a crisis with SRM, it would somehow land somewhere in the UN system. The reality is there is no natural home for this issue in the UN system, and the UN Security Council itself has never been briefed on this issue. The organization I previously worked for was planning to do a briefing on the invitation of the then rotating presidency of the Security Council, Belgium. We were preparing for that briefing, and then COVID hit, and of course everything flew out the window. So the Security Council itself has never been briefed on this issue, nor has there been a UN General Assembly-wide discussion of this issue itself either. So the idea that the UN would somehow naturally be able to cope with a sudden emergency or a threatened deployment is fallacious. I think at best it would be a muddling through, which is not a good place to be. Perception. I think the possibility of a threat of deployment could be a casus belli, And perception, even more than fact, could be the driving force behind that. So take an example that's quite well known in the community. One country decides to have a large-scale test. I won't get into the definition of large-scale here. Decides to do an outdoor test that has transboundary impacts for climatic reasons. Lo and behold, across the border, there are varying weather conditions in the next few weeks. It is very easy to see how in those circumstances it could be seen as a provocation, a deliberate provocation for war, even under the best, most beneficent intentions. And so the whole issue of perception and cycling of disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theory, given the rapidity of social media and all the rest of it, is a real concern. And it would be very interesting to see more research done on this specific issue of how the misinformation, disinformation cycle takes off, and it itself can drive responses that are potentially triggers for conflict. Another issue that has been talked about in terms of SRM and security is the Arctic. There have been some discussions in the past that the Arctic would be one of the natural sites for deployment of SRM, SAI, because of the gravity of its climatic situation, 4 times the degree of warming than anywhere else in the world, potential for climate tipping points, global climate tipping points. But if one looks at this calculus of actors in the Arctic right now, in the immediate next to 3 years, it is hard to see why there would be a motivation on the part of the US, on the part of Russia, or on the part of China for deploying SRM. It actually goes against kind of what their political, geopolitical interests might be in that region. So here's a case where potentially the thought of a theater for conflict might actually, for very skewed reasons, be lessening. Let's see. In Tyler's presentation, he was looking at the calculus of the US and China and whether they agreed or disagreed and what the conflict might entail. I think it is very important as we think about the future of diplomacy on these issues to think about, could there potentially be a path in which American and Chinese scholars jointly research SRM from all perspectives, not just from a biophysical perspective, but from social sciences perspective as well? Could there be a path for some kind of track to diplomacy, something akin to the pugwash movement back in the Cold War era, to lessen the chance of a conflict or a direct clash between the two superpowers on the future of SRM? I leave it as an open question, but I think it's a question that deserves serious exploration, and it may have very serious consequences for the world going forward. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you to all our panelists. We'll go to questions. If the panelists would like to sit up front, or yes, you in the blue shirt? Yeah. Sorry, I'll bring the mic.
Being recorded, or?
I think it is.
So what I've heard discussed here is the act of deploying SRM as sort of a single act, or sort of on par with a military act. But I'm curious how you all as researchers factor in the termination shock and the sort of actual expected timelines of a deployment. How does that change the security situation?
There's a mic here.
Just a few opening comments on that. I think there's not a lot of understanding about termination shock among policymakers, among potential decision makers in the defense security community. My understanding of the latest science, I am not a scientist, I should put that out there, is that a gradual ramp up of deployment, then scaled back would not necessarily cause a termination shock if it were done within a decade or 5 to 10 years. I may be wrong on that. That's my understanding. The perception, though, is that the risk of termination shock is severe. And that is a concerning element when thinking of deployment, and it is certainly a concerning element if one thinks of the possibility of counter geoengineering.
I think we should be careful to think in decadal or perhaps century-long scenarios if we're talking about even temporary SRM, if it's predicated on, its temporariness is predicated on successful CDR and mitigation, that even temporary is very, very long term, and that's an even longer time in geopolitics than it is in geological time. And so it's hard to rule this kind of thing out, I think, also because irrespective of incentives, which assumes a kind of rationality even at the individual level, but also at the collective level, I think is a very heroic assumption to assume for a long time out into the future. So I personally take it quite seriously, irrespective of the fact that probably you could patch it up in some ways if there was a termination for some reason, but we really can't predict why it would be stopped, and therefore whether or how or why it might be then continued by somebody else.
I would just add on to that. I completely agree with the assertion that you just made that if SRM, SAI were to be used and to be phased out in a way that was safe, we're looking at decades, if not a century more, of deployment because of the exit ramps being such a high bar in terms of mitigation and CDR. I completely agree with that.
Sure, just two figures. Just to join two dots quickly, I think Cynthia mentioned it. The conversation around this in security circles, let alone wider, is generally very poorly informed and very poorly thought through in very practical terms. Gwynne and Cynthia, you all touched on this. But at this point you talked about timelines. I think the most significant thing on the timeline, if you think about SAI, that is missing from a lot of the security conversations is the time it takes to build up towards any large-scale deployment. And so from a security perspective, just to drop in here, we can pick it up later, the key point is this is detectable and is going to be looked for and is being looked at. So long before you get anywhere near a deployment, let alone questions of termination shock, the security piece is who does what in response to perceived build-up of potential activity. And for what it's worth, as several people have touched on, neither the US nor China will tolerate anyone controlling the global climate except themselves. So neither of them would let anything go very far beyond or starting to explore something.
Cynthia, I'd love to hear you say more about Pugwash, not just because it's a Canadian town, but really thinking about how that movement, which really did have a role in international security around nuclear weapons, how that analog works or doesn't work for this topic in a U.S.-China.
Are we waiting for other questions, or should I respond?
Go ahead.
To be honest, David, I haven't thought it through at great length. I would love to have conversations about this with folks at this conference, but I think the idea that cooperation between the two superpowers in the development of a technology that potentially has implications for every country on Earth is critically important to a safe future. And I would strongly suggest that more research be done into this area, that we look at this. This is an avenue where potentially the prospects for success are limited, but the calamity that might result if there's competing research or competing senses of whether deployment is a wise move or not is great enough that I think it provides incentive to look at these peaceful paths.
Sorry, what is Pugwash?
Pugwash is a town in Nova Scotia, actually, in Canada. It was a site, a very rural site called Pugwash in the middle of nowhere, and that was the intention, where U.S. and Soviet nuclear scientists met at the height of the Cold War. I believe they started in 1954. Albert Einstein was one of the original promoters of this concept. And they met throughout the Cold War. And they actually won the Nobel Prize for Peace in the 1980s, I believe. Pugwash is still going on. There's Pugwash student movements in universities around the world. It's a fascinating movement, and I think one that we might look at for potentials for peaceful development of this technology.
You as a British Canadian
Sorry.
Okay. We'll start a second with 2 quick questions.
Just a really quick two-finger, because it's interesting that people haven't heard of this. I mean, so me forgetting SRM as a physicist who cared about public policy, my elders were involved in smuggling information back and forth, including from Sakharov. So the elite physicists on both sides figured out how to communicate, partly anchored through that mechanism, against the wishes of their superiors in ways that I think measurably reduced the chance of a war.
I can add to that, David. I've met people who've done the same thing.
Okay, in the interest of time, we're going to cycle through a few. I have Mark, then Alan, then Andrew. So we'll ask you, panelists, please remember the questions.
Or not. Sure, Mark from SRM 360. We focused a certain amount on security and conflict between states. I was wondering how much consideration there had been of domestic terrorism related to potential geoengineering and or, basically non-state actors doing international terrorism with regards to geoengineering, and to what degree considerations around their hopes, concerns, capabilities might be different to the ones you outlined regarding states.
Cynthia, you said if the U.S. or Canada were to deploy very quickly, but as was stated before, it'll take a decade or so before you could have any equipment to do it. It hasn't been invented. It's on the drawing boards. People have suggested maybe in the Arctic, but still the equipment doesn't exist. So I think it would take a long time to actually do it if people decided to do it. And I'm going to attend the 63rd Pugwash Conference in Hiroshima in November to honor the 80th anniversary of dropping the bomb there. So Pugwash internationally is still working, and there's a lot of other anti-nuclear groups too, but Pugwash is still around, not so much in the United States anymore.
Actually, do you want to respond to Mark's question while I get the next one? On non-state actors?
Yeah, very briefly. I've not really heard a credible scenario with that. It's not being discussed with folks in kind of security Washington think tanks. I do think it's more of a hype than it is a reality.
There's no critical element in the equation in terms of deploying. I mean, we're talking about large volumes of material being put into the stratosphere by large numbers of vehicles on a repetitive cycle, and nothing in particular that you could do would have the same impact as, for example, taking down the Twin Towers. There's no vulnerable or even dramatically satisfying target for terrorism.
I think I would caveat that a little bit and say this would be a global critical infrastructure, and like all global critical infrastructures would be subject to security measures, and it would be weird if it was not. But I agree that I think it's a smaller fish in a bigger pond.
Okay, we have some more time, so we'll take three in quick succession. I have Andrew, Ben, and the gentleman up front.
There's been
quick response.
Yeah, been a lot of focus on like the US and China as superpowers, but superpowers don't like to fight each other. So normally they have proxy wars, like we see all over the world. But currently in Ukraine, you could argue that's a proxy war. Is it not likely that like a mid-scale, reasonably competent power, like for example, Bangladesh or Brazil or whatever, could be tacitly supported by one of the superpowers and seen as being a kind of arm's length actor, somewhat neutral but somewhat supported in a kind of messy hybrid?
Yeah, I think that's a potential. We can't rule that out either. It happens in other spheres, but I do I do doubt it. Just on a hunch. I mean, what do we know?
Yeah, this is maybe a really cynical question. So, Olaf, you mentioned the war on drugs wasn't a huge success, but I would ask, success for whom? And we've seen there are a few people out there who are willing to manipulate or destroy entire systems just to make themselves slightly richer. So I was wondering if you all could get a little more specific about what you see as likely that SRM would be used for, if not for climate.
Well, pass the parcel. I don't actually see any. It seems to me a remarkably benign technology in terms of its potential for doing damage of a politically satisfactory sort, if you see what I mean. You know, one can imagine all sorts of damage it might do if misused in terms of blighting economies and so on, but not with a speed and a specificity that would make it politically satisfactory.
Hi there. This is really not my field, and this is probably a truly stupid question. But it seems like you're framing this potential conflict as between somebody or an entity or a nation state doing SRM and another entity opposing them. What about conflict between parties who are not active directly in doing any of these things? And I'll use the African example. What if, for example, China decides to do this at a global scale? What about conflict within the African continent that results? And I'm looking at what we heard this morning, the models showing that rainfall will increase over West Africa, but decrease over Southern Africa. And I'm using my own real-life example here as a resident of this city, Cape Town. We really almost ran out of water in 2018. We came within days, and it was absolutely terrifying. There's a very well-established animus between South Africa and Nigeria. It's a funny cultural joke, but it's also a real thing. What happens if China goes off, does SRM, suddenly Nigeria is wallowing in rain, their agriculture's doing well, they're all super happy, and we're sitting on drought where multiple Southern African cities are running out of water, which is a real situation because we're still right on the edge here in Cape Town of running out of water. It takes very little to get that. Okay. What about that?
To be honest, I haven't thought about it. It's a really interesting question, but is your question, does the use of SRM by a superpower that causes impacts in other countries, what is the response to that? Or
I mean, my question is, yeah, why aren't we thinking in those terms? And what are the potential knock-ons of that? Maybe they don't care.
I think I can answer.
The world doesn't care about Africa, right?
No, I think I can answer. It's an open research question that needs to be answered. So conflict between nations who aren't doing SRM but are affected by SRM. Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. We'll have to take our last question. I'm sorry. Final question.
Yeah, I think in the scenarios that were being discussed, I didn't see anybody talk about a contingency plan. And I don't know whether it's a far thought kind of a thing, because we're still not kind of sure of the technology itself, and that's why we're not talking about the contingency plan. We don't understand the risks better. What is the reason why, if there is something that happens, what is the backup plan that the world has that we're discussing in the context of securitization?
I'd like to go back to the previous question but one, about what else it could be used for, but I don't know if somebody else should just answer this one. So I think there are two basic alternatives to a climate logic, and one is the security logic. Even though it's difficult to weaponize, you can't use it to blow up someone's bridge. It's a major strategic resource to have control over the Earth's energy budget. And that could also be intertwined with kind of domestic regime, security, and prestige. The other one is economic, where if your economy happens to be based on exporting fossil fuels, or a combination of the two, where if your economy is based on fossil fuels, but your dollar supremacy is also based on fossil fuel transactions being committed in dollars, and your global military reach is predicated still on fossil fuels for your jet and other tools, then if your strategic global aim is to maintain global supremacy, and this is to a large degree predicated on a continuation of the fossil economy and infrastructure, then you have a strategic contradiction to solve, and the sort of macro role for SRM, there would be a political, obviously it wouldn't really solve anything, but it would be a political way of resolving that conflict. Potentially it could be exploited as a kind of mitigation deterrence in to the power of two at least. So those are the two main.
I've run out of thoughts.
Okay, yeah, maybe that's the final word. Thank you, everybody, and thank you to all of Cynthia, Gwynne, and Scott remotely.